Good morning, beloveds. Let's gather today. Your voice, it thunders. The oaks start twisting. The forest sounds with cedars breaking. The waters see you and start arriving. From the depths a song is rising. Now it's rising from the ground. Holy, 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 holy Lord. The earth is yours and singing holy, 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 holy Lord. The earth is yours. The earth is yours. Your voice, it thunders. The ground is shaking. The mighty mountains now are trembling. Creation sees you and starts composing. Fields and trees, they start rejoicing. Now it's rising from the ground. Now it's rising from the ground. Hear us crying out. Hear us crying out. Holy, 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 holy Lord. The earth is yours and singing holy, 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 holy Lord. The earth is yours and singing holy, 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 holy Lord. The earth is yours and the earth is yours. The earth is yours.
We have had the benefit of Ryan Gnaben's musical leadership as well as his talents with technology and other forms of worship for several years. He and Kyle Miller-Shani have contributed richly not only this week to the worship life of the seminary, but to the worship life of this event, but to the worship life of the seminary, and I'm grateful. Thank you. I also promised I would make a shout out for all of the staff and faculty at Phillips, and today I lift up for praise and gratitude the business office. We never see those people. They live on this back hall. I call it the Hall of Introverts. And I go back on tiptoe because there is no noise in that building. In that section of the building, they are working their heads off. They pay the bills. They bring the money. They keep us moving. They watch the building and take care of all of the building issues. They provide support in every way to the teaching and learning work of the seminary, and I am so grateful for the ways they constantly are faithful stewards of all that the seminary has been given. One more person, then there's Ashley Gibson. Yes, yes. Ashley, we're thanking you. We're thanking you. Ashley runs the office, runs my office, runs me, runs a good bit of the seminary programming, and we're so grateful for all the ways that she offers support and hospitality and kindness and shares in frustrations and then deals with them and does something beautiful and wonderful in the midst of them. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you. So, when I'm not running a seminary, I'm watching churches. And what has captivated me in the last 10 to 15 years of the great upheaval that we've been going through is ecclesiolatry. That is to say, an excessive devotion to church or to various forms of church that somehow we think are synonymous with gospel. And so then we begin to worship those forms of church. Now, I personally really do believe that Jesus was born with a pipe organ in his hand. That's a form of ecclesiolatry. And one of its most insidious forms is the idolatry of the building. That is to say, we're always looking for ways to preserve, protect, and make beautiful and keep safe our building, forgetting this fundamental truth about Christianity, especially in the first couple of centuries. We were never called together to a place. Christianity is not about place. It's about relationship. Christianity is not about the rituals that take place in a place. It is rather about the rituals that happen among and between people and the created world. Our speaker this morning is the Reverend Victoria Lures, who has been thinking far more deeply about this particular issue than I have. And she has ways of pointing to church beyond, as beautiful as this room, beyond this room, beyond those beautiful buildings, beyond the fronts of churches that protect those pipes for that lovely pipe organ. And she calls us to remember that what we are about is not building, but relationship. And then she broadens that in challenging ways. I'm challenged that it's not just about us people. I really thought it was about me, but about a greater part of the world. Victoria founded the Church of the Wild, 20 years ago? Okay, just the other day. And out of that, also, she has founded the Seminary of the Wild, which I don't have to view as competition, right? Yeah. So partnership is exactly it. Because what they offer in the Seminary of the Wild is classes and webinars and coaching opportunities and conversations about how we can be church beyond building. So it is my great honor to welcome to this gathering Victoria Lures. She has written a new book that came out in October called, Church of the Wild. I have read it. It will stretch you in really fabulous ways. And she has a few more copies here if you want to get one from her. So we are so grateful you're with us and look forward to your wisdom. Thank you.
Gosh, thank you, Dr. Pittman. Thank you, Terry, are you here? For inviting me here. And thank you, Phillips, and all of you who have studied here, are connected here, are doing the great work through this visionary educational and life-giving community. I wasn't sure, I've never been to Oklahoma before. I wasn't sure what to expect. I had to admit my own sort of biases is like, oh, Oklahoma, they're not going to want to hear what I have to say. But Nancy assured me that this is a place that really is stretching the boundaries. And I've read some things and heard some things from different people here. And I'm so encouraged about the prophetic ministry you have here and the gifts that you're bringing into this particular community to widen our compassion and our love for one another and for the church, and for how God is calling us deeper into relationship. I have been learning about the work that you've been doing with anti-racism, and I'm so grateful for that prophetic and missional work that you are doing to remind us of our calling to restore love to a vulnerable and interconnected world. So I love how this conference is called Remind and Restore. So it's an honor to be here, and it's a gift to be able to hear the work that you are all doing to renew and to remind, the truthing and the reconciling. Thank you. I believe that we are all here in this room aware, and those of you who couldn't make it here through COVID or other reasons and are online, that we're aware that we're standing on the threshold of really profound change. I believe that we're witnessing a slow motion collapse of an empire. Some kind of seismic shift is happening, and we're in this really fragile time of unraveling in our culture and on our planet. And it's a shift that's full of grief and loss and unknowing and reckoning and failure and vision. It's an invitation for us to collectively stand in this unknowing together and to allow the unfolding and the undoing that needs to happen in order for what is emerging. I believe that as the species decline and these polarities continue to widen and the violence quickens, that there's an awakening happening. They go together. And we need to stay close to one another in this emergence, because what is emerging and what we are losing are happening at the same time, and we need one another. We are remembering ourselves back together to one another in relationship as people, and together in a larger sense of beloved community, not just the community of people we live near, not just the community of our church, not just the community of the church, but the community of all humanity and the community beyond humanity, because we're part of an interconnected web of life, and we've forgotten that. How we regard and treat anything, Richard Rohr has said this for so many years, how we regard this stone is how we regard everything. And I used to really like that, but I didn't really get it. I feel like I'm just starting to get what that means. This restoration that we're talking about, this restoring, is no longer just about our own species, which needs plenty of restoration, as we know. But it's beyond that. It's not just our species as if we're the only ones who matter. That idea, that orientation is part of the old story. That's the old story that's crumbling. The old story that continues to be exposed as a story that's constructed in service to white supremacy and patriarchy. It's a story that's constructed to be in service only to the human species. How you treat anything is how you treat everything. And we have actually lost connection to place. Not place in the way Nancy was just talking about, but place as in where we belong as beings within this interconnected, whole, alive planet. We have separated ourselves and we've elevated ourselves and our species as the only ones who matter. And so we've forgotten our place in this interconnected system. We have a place here. We belong. We are part of nature. But the dominion and the domination story that our culture lives with, that was founded, that our story, our Christian story of Adam and Eve, of dominating culture, of dominating the rest of the world, has been used as a weapon of mass destruction by empire for many centuries. And it's given us humans permission to elevate our own needs over the needs of all other beings. And this is a false system of separation and dominance, and it's opposed to every system of life. This intentional severance of nature and the human soul has caused severe damage because we can only oppress that which we dehumanize. And so we call everything that is not human an it. Empire is kind of like the shorthand that I use for the systemic severance of the human soul from the interlocking, interconnected, mycelial interbeing, as our great leader Thich Nhat Hanh that we just lost always said, the web of interbeing with every living being and all places on this planet. So we as a society, and particularly as spiritual leaders, are being asked to reckon with the reality that a select few humans have benefited from a patriarchal society that has taken the gift of life on earth and treated it as a right. Those in the dominant Western culture have demanded not just the fruit of the tree, but the whole tree, and the water and the sun and the birds and the beetles too. We've consumed it all as if we were the only ones who mattered, as if the rest of the earth were here just for our taking. Professor and philosopher and author and visionary Carol White observes that the same root of objectification and underlying racial oppression is the same. She says there's a lethal combination of intimately conjoined white supremacy and species supremacy. Both of these impulses evoke a hierarchical model of nature that's built on this idea of the great chain of being. And that has produced, she says, violent and harmful consequences. Does that make sense? That we are saying that it's the same objectification that we've done with people of color, that we are doing with the rest of the natural world. And at the root of that separation and and I keep wanting to say enlightenment, it's the opposite of enlightenment, that elevation of certain people and certain species over all others produced violent and harmful consequences, and we can see it all over our planet right now, and we can see it all over our culture. So this hierarchy that Dr. White names is deeply embedded in every aspect of our society and our worldview. The needs and the desires of those on the top of the pyramid are prioritized, and everyone and everything else is objectified and valued according to their usefulness to those on the top. Forests become lumber, cows become beef, deer become game, land becomes private property, people of color become cheap labor or a threat. This is a false belief system of separation and dominance that's opposed to everything that we hold dear as followers of Jesus. These old worldviews are so deeply embedded that it takes a lot of effort even to see them, much less to change them. So for me, after 30 years in the church and in the environmental movement, I can now say with some urgency, the very real, concrete, and changes that our world desperately needs, these changes that we know we need, and yet we so desperately resist these changes. They won't happen without a profound change of heart. What we need can't be legislated or explained or resolved through a great sermon or a great campaign or a new election. What is needed is something that you all of you, are uniquely prepared to bring. What is needed is deeply seated at the core of our religious tradition. What is needed is love. There's a new story emerging, and I can't pretend to know all the layers of that story, but one aspect that seems essential relates to the worldview of belonging, a way of being human that acts as if we belong to a community larger than our own family and our own race and our own class and our own culture and our own species. There's an apocalyptic unveiling happening right now in our world of pandemics and racial pushback, that we're starting to see it. It's difficult now, even for those of us that have been sheltered in privilege, to look away from the reality, both tragic and beautiful, that we are all deeply interconnected. Humans, trees, deer, viruses, bees, God. But you know what? We were made for this. I was taking a walk the other day down to the bay, and I passed these 5 fifth grade boys, and they were, on an adventure, and they went off the trail into these blackberries, and they're like, "This is it, this is the trail." And I hear one of the boys, as I keep walking, he goes, "Come on, boys, we were made for this." We were made for this. Come on, friends, we were made for this time. We're here. We are the ones that are here, that have been chosen, I think, to be here at this time. We are the alive generations that are seeing this rapid decline and are the beginnings of this great emergence. These layers of crises and cruelty that we face will not be solved with technological, political, or economic strategies alone. A deeper transformation of heart is necessary to welcome in a new story. So as we move away from a worldview and a way of life that treats others as what Thomas Berry calls a collection of objects, toward a new way of being human that participates honorably in a vast communion of subjects. This is what Thomas Berry calls the great conversation. He says, we are in trouble because we don't have a good story. Thomas Berry was a Catholic priest and an evolutionary theologian. He said, we are between stories. The old story, as we know, is no longer effective. But we have not yet learned the new story. It's still emerging. But here's the key that he says, the key to finding our way to that new story, that story of compassion and love and a way of life that actually lives as if you love God and love your neighbors, all your neighbors, as yourself. Thomas Berry says that we can only find the wisdom for this new story by reconnecting, which is the root meaning of religion, ligios, ligament, connecting again. We can only find the wisdom for this new story by reconnecting with the rest of the world as a sacred relationship. He says, we are talking only to ourselves. We are not talking to the rivers. We are not listening to the wind and stars. We have broken the great conversation. By breaking that conversation, he says, we have shattered the universe. Over the last 30 years, I've wrestled with this broken conversation as a pastor of indoor churches, as a climate activist, as a mother, and now as a guide who leads people in spiritual practices that reconnect them with the natural world as sacred. This wild church idea is only one expression of something that is more than just a fun way for outdoorsy people to go on a hike and call it church. This is an urgent call for reformation and renewal at a crucial time in our history. This is a theological emergence. It's a moving from dominance to stewardship. That's been important. That's been sort of my life work. And all the work that we're doing to be more mindful about our impact on the other species is really essential. But I think now there's something even deeper that's being asked of us. It's a deeper spiritual reformation. It's moving from stewardship to relationship. Restoring the great conversation is an act of ritual. It's a call and a response. It's an external act, a series of external acts, like all rituals are, that confirms an inner reality of relationality, of relationship. Ritual, as an English term in the 16th century, meant to restore relationship. Our rituals are to restore relationship with one another, like a baptism or a wedding. It's a way of restoring relationship to our primary relationship with the sacred. But as we create new rituals for restoring relationship with the natural world, we are creating a new way of restoring that conversation and entering into what is emerging. We are part of creating that new story. In my tradition, which is your tradition, at moments like this, at pivotal moments like this, God calls people into the wilderness on purpose. The call into the wild was issued to nearly every single leader in our biblical stories. In my years of preaching for indoor churches, I would regularly spiritualize and metaphorize wilderness as something like tough times or, dark night of the soul or something like that. But as I've been awakening to the importance of intimate connection with nature, I began to wonder what role the actual wilderness plays in these stories. It had to mean something more than internal wrestling with ego or demons or something like that. What role did the actual physical dirt and heat and burning bushes and wild creatures play in these transformational moments in history and in the developmental journeys of those leaders that are being called into leadership? God revealed God's self to Moses, not in the tabernacle, but in a bush, in the wind, and on the top of a mountain. The enslaved people escaping from Egypt were sent into the wilderness, not the promised land, for 40 years. Hagar escaped the jealousy of Sarah in the wilderness. Elijah fled alone to the wilderness to escape Jezebel's pursuit. Jonah tried to run from his calling and was consumed by a wild mammal of the sea, and then heard a clear message from a gourd plant that was shielding him in the wilderness. When I first started to discover this, I was tripping out. I kept looking. I was like, oh my gosh, every single one of them. Job, Abraham, Isaiah, Joshua, Solomon, Hosea, Ezekiel, they were all sent into the wilderness. And then in the New Testament, this story continues. John the Baptist, Jesus, Paul, at pivotal moments in their lives, they were called into service first by being called into the wild. Jesus went into the mountains to pray. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all mention it many times, and so it makes sense that our churches, we are learning how to pray is a big agenda for us. Centering prayer, taizé prayer, silent prayer, petition prayer, liturgical prayer, confession prayer, prayer without ceasing prayer, prayers of the people prayer. But when was the last time you led your people and taught them how to go to the mountain? Jesus didn't go to the buildings to pray. Jesus went to or into a mountain, or along the lakeshore, or into the wilderness, or in the garden. For some reason, well, for lots of reasons, that part of the spiritual journey has generally been ignored. In the Gospel of Mark, he locates the baptism scene, Jesus' baptism scene, in the wilderness. And the word that is used is in, which is the Greek word en. It's a locator word, it's a locational word, and it refers to a position in and among. So John was in the wilderness, an actual place, which must be important because Mark wanted you to make sure that you remembered it. In the first chapter of his gospel, he uses the word wilderness 9 times. Mark used that preposition in a location to locate this particular place, this particular river where John was baptizing people. It was in the actual river Jordan. The people were baptized in this river, En. Jesus, however, on the other hand, was baptized into the proposition eis, into, which means ice means a penetration of or a union with. It's a relational word. Jesus was baptized ice into the river. And then a wild bird descended ice into Jesus. And then Jesus was sent ice into the wilderness. That Greek preposition ice is relational. This distinction is important. It's the difference between me saying I'm from California and saying I live in a particular place in California and I have deep, and I know this particular place. I'm in relationship with this place. I'm growing plants in this place. I know the animals in this place. I defend this place. This is precisely why Church of the Wild is not called Church in the Wild. We aren't just meeting outside in a lovely location. When we gather as wild churches among the cedar trees and the oak groves and the city parks or the shade in a park, we're entering into relationship with this place, with our home. We're expanding our experience of prayer, and we're also learning how and why Jesus went into the mountain to do it. There's an unmediated presence of God that can only be experienced outside the human constructs of civilization when we enter into reverent relationship with the natural world. Have you ever felt that when you've spent enough time out in the wild, where you can feel something shift? You're more in touch with something bigger than you. One of our primary rituals, with the of baptism, is informed by this same insight. That God initiated Jesus into relationship with the wild river. This is a mystical word, into, penetration, union with. It's a word of deep connection and intimacy. It's a word that takes seriously the call to love and to belong to your place. Baptism into a river is a wilderness immersion that initiates an intimate and vulnerable union, not just with the other people in your church community, but with the whole living world. Why? Why is that? A big aha for me was when I learned that the word for wilderness in Hebrew, used throughout the Old Testament over 300 times, is a word called midbar, midbar. It's a derivative, though, it's rooted in a verb, though, dabar, which means speaking. Midbar, translated as wilderness, the very first translation in the Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew and English lexicon, and every other lexicon you can go check in the library. The very first definition of midbar, noun, masculine, definition, number 1, mouth. Mouth, the organ which speaks. The second definition, wilderness. That changes the whole story for me. Therefore, I led them out of Egypt and brought them into the wilderness. It's not simply a harsh backdrop for a human drama. The wilderness is often portrayed as the site of 40 years of Israel's terrible wandering in the wilderness, as a place that totally changes the tone of it, doesn't it? That they were called into wilderness to listen to the voice of the Holy speaking to them through the wilderness. What if God knows that there's simply no better way to rehabilitate from the effects of trauma than immersion into wilderness? Seeing the wilderness as an organ of speech, the part of the living earth that speaks. transforms it from a harsh place of difficulty into a tender place of intimacy, a tender place of sacred intimacy. There's something just about being in a wildish place for an extended time. First, the silence allows you to hear your own voice. And at first, it's that chatter of distractions of like, oh, it was better back when we were under oppression. But if you allow yourself to stay in relationship with that wilderness long enough, you can start to feel that those chattery voices fade. And you can start to hear the voices of the wind and the rain and the chickadees. And then eventually you can hear it. It's a deeper silence. It's an invitation to listen to the voice of the wilderness, the organ which speaks, the sacred, a voice that is deeply your own, and also the trees, and also God. What if Moses and his traumatized people were sent into wilderness not as some sort of mocking punishment for their complaining or some intense, almost cruel object lesson? What if the wilderness was instead a place to listen to the sacred speaking through the voices of burning bushes, calling people to remember that they belonged to a greater story? Exodus reports that the Israelites were captive under Egyptian colonization for more than 400 years. Unlearning an identity of oppression and restoring a new character of belonging and purpose probably takes at least 40 years. Rather than a punishment, being sent into the wilderness becomes a provision, an opportunity for listening and deepening relationship. In the wilderness, the place that speaks, you find that you are not alone. You can remember who you already are. In Hosea, the people have a story where God says, "Therefore, behold, I will allure her, and bring her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her." That makes me almost cry. It's so beautiful. In the Christian context, Jesus says to his disciples more than once, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourself." Deserted place, eremos, wilderness. Come away by yourselves and rest. As I reimagine the wilderness in this more tender way, I can understand why Jesus repeated this act of penetrating relationship with the wilderness all throughout his life. Jesus went into the mountains to pray. I looked up every single reference of Jesus going to pray that occurs in the Gospels. And only one time is the preposition "en" used to make a point about the location of the prayer spot. Every single other reference uses that more intimate preposition of union and relationship, as in the baptism stories. Jesus went into the mountain, the lake, a garden beyond a particular winter stream, the wilderness, and a solitary place to pray. His prayer place was in the wilderness, yes, but he went there to enter into a union with the sacred and to listen to the organ which speaks, to listen to the sacred, to listen to the Father who was speaking through the wild elements there. It seems to me that we're missing something really important and really pivotal to understanding Jesus and prayer. Are we not also called to enter into relationship with the wilds, with the wildest places near your home, to listen to the divine? And is not prayer also a conversation? It is a listening and a responding and a listening and responding. It's almost as if you can't understand prayer or mountains without practicing them both together. It's not just about changing the location of your prayer as you know it to the outdoors, any more than Church of the Wild is about doing church the way it's always been done, only outside. There's a mysterious union that happens when we enter into relationship with the wild and practice sacred conversation. Prayer isn't a one-way sermon. It's a reciprocal back and forth. an act of listening and responding. Like any deep conversation, do you know how that feels when you've entered into an authentic conversation where you feel seen, you feel enlightened, you feel excited? I'm a pretty deep introvert, but when I enter into a real authentic conversation, I walk away light. I can do 10 hours a day, feel sorry for me, yes, on Zoom, but they are, and I'm not exhausted, even as an introvert, because they're deep conversations that I'm entering into. I have up to 8 to 10 deep conversations a day with people, and it brings me alive. And you know how that feels. You're not so much responding to each other as you are entering into an action, a relationship being. You're authentically interested in the other person's point of view, and you're not proving your own as right. An authentic conversation asks you to be fully present and appreciate and see the other person's uniqueness and discover what you have in common and what you have that is diverse and different from you. And you can drop your old ideas in the authentic conversations for new ones that emerge through this backing and forthing. It's a sacred reciprocity. Conversation is like the vehicle, it's like the artery of connection. It's like the thing that makes connection happen, whether it's with a friend or with a field of clover. Somewhere in the conversation, the content isn't even important anymore because the exchange itself creates and deepens relationship. And there's a lot of science happening now about, the song of trees, the ways that our immersion in nature, like with forest bathing, Japanese forest bathing, and how the science is showing that our blood pressure goes down, we can be calmer and have a more focused mind when we're in nature. And that is all good, that we are waking up to the benefits of connecting with nature for our own health. But it's more than that. The living world is where we can be opened up in receptivity to a divine encounter. There's an invitation here for all of us. In order to listen for the holy, to engage in intimate conversation with the sacred, one goes into the wilderness. I want to ask you to just take a little bit of time to think about that, about how you have been called into the wilderness. Maybe you didn't recognize that, your desire to go outside more during the pandemic wasn't just about being locked down. There might have been something else behind that. I'd like to invite you to talk about that with somebody right now for just a few minutes. And for those of you on connecting through the internet, maybe it's some time to journal, or you could connect through the chat. Thinking about, have you been called into the wilderness, and what could that mean for you? Have you had an encounter where something felt like you were in the presence of God? And just noticing that, just starting to pay attention to that, I think is what we're looking for here. Is just starting to pay attention that in times like these, God calls his people into the wilderness. My book is called Church of the Wild, How Nature Invites Us into the Sacred. And that's true. But the sacred also invites us into nature. And so this is the invitation for you to just take the next, 5 or 6 minutes to talk with one another, whoever's sitting closest to you. Just think about that. Where have you maybe been called, and maybe you didn't realize it, maybe you did, to connect with nature as a way of connecting with God for these times? And, oh, gosh. The wilderness is speaking, present tense. We need only to learn how to listen and how to value it and how to pay attention and how to enter into even deeper relationship with God than we've experienced. And that happens through relationship. It happens through relationship with our neighbors, with the people, and all the beings who are our beloved community. And that community is a lot wider than our church. Since we are interconnected with all things, and we're part of a living system held together by love, by Christ, we are called into the wild, just like our ancestors, to listen and to remember who we are and what is needed from us right now in this groaning world at this moment of unraveling and emergence. This conversation with the wild is prayer. It's a prayer that we engage that's not a metaphor. It's an actual relationship. And it doesn't happen in English. Even when you have a conversation with your spouse or your child, social scientists tell us that only 7% of that conversation is through spoken word. It's wordless, and the ancients had a word for it. 500 years before Jesus, the Greek philosophers called it logos. Logos was first used in a cosmological way by Heraclitus of Ephesus. He was a Greek philosopher in the 5th century BCE. And he used this word, he created and used this word logos to articulate a kind of intelligent life force that was embedded in and interconnecting all things. This is from one of his fragments. He calls it a divine reason implicit in the cosmos, ordering it and giving it form and meaning. The scholars say that was one of the most revolutionary concepts ever developed. There's a quote from one of the scholars. He says, as an intellectual and scientific development, this discovery of a unitary nature was as revolutionary as the Hebrews' monotheism was in the history of ancient religions. Heraclitus developed logos to conceptualize the way that the world functions as one unit, as one system. And he also coined the word cosmos. So logos is this principle, this power that shapes and creates all things, that's immanent and embedded in everything that exists. And he saw things not really as things. He saw them as processes. But we're such a noun-based culture, we see everything as nouns and things, but verb-based cultures, which is most indigenous cultures, including Hebrew, see things as the relationship between. So it's all about the verbs, the action between. Later, so he said that logos he intuited, was this relationship between all things, holding them together. And other followers of Heraclitus would use the word logos to describe this relationship between as a process of conversation. So logos held this implicit sense that is really similar to what the biologists are revealing about the way that trees talk to one another. And what keeps them alive is not just their roots and their carbon dioxide in the sun, but this complex and emotionally alive relationship between them. And the way that they communicate, the trees through the mycelium, is often called conversation. Just like what the quantum scientists discovered, that at the center of molecules is not things, but relationships. And neutrons and protons aren't really things. They're a relationship in this constant conversation. It's a verb. That this conversation is actually at the center of all things, like it is, biologically. So a few centuries after the death of Jesus, the writer of the Gospel of John used this familiar concept of logos as a really culturally relevant way to understand the significance of Jesus in the context of Christ. And they wrote, or the writers of the Gospel of John wrote, "In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. This was with God in the beginning. All things came into being through this, and apart from this, nothing came into being that has come into being. And the Logos became flesh and dwelt among us." We can see in that context it had a very different meaning than the way we understand that scripture now. But the theologians and the bishops who first studied the Gospel of John in those first 3 centuries understood what the evangelist was trying to express. That logos is this relational force inherent in all things and holding together all things by this relationship between, this conversation. And so logos was an apt metaphor and description for Christ and for the role that Jesus was fulfilling by embodying the Christ. Because logos happens through relationship. So this action of conversing, this intimate abiding and turning to one another back and forth is like this sensual, living, flowing, never-ending relationship. It is the original primal relationship that has existed since the beginning, and it's enacted in all matter and through and between and with all manner of being. It's a relationship that all beings are part of. So can we entertain that this relationship, this conversation, not only describes a desirable way of living in relational conversations with other humans, but is simply just the way life works? It's the way ecosystems work. It's the way forests work. It's the way galaxies work. And it's also the very being of God. And the Logos was God. Up until the 4th century, translators consistently translated the Greek word logos into Latin, the language of the church, as a word sermo, which ironically doesn't mean sermon. It means conversation. Sermo indicates that a lively discourse, a dialogue, a manner of speaking back and forth. It's a very intimate word. It's a noun created from the root verb sero, which means to weave or to join together. It's an intimate living of life together, sermo, living in familiarity, intimate conversation, the act of living with. Sermo was the Latin translation that best fit the meaning of logos. In the beginning was the conversation, and the conversation was with God, and the conversation was God. All things came into being through this conversation. And apart from this, nothing came into being that has come into being, and the conversation became flesh and dwelt among us. Sit with that for just a second. Christ as an embodied, sensual, intimate reciprocity of giving and receiving, of listening and sharing vulnerably. Christ as that sacred conversation that brings all things into being and links all things together. Christ as love. In the beginning, the conversation created all things, and through conversation made all things new. It's not a provocative religious image, it's actually a biological description of how life works. Entering into authentic conversation and relationship with others of all species, including our own, we participate in the story of Christ, our collective unfolding and becoming. In the beginning was the conversation. We are all part of an interconnected web of life. Conversations going on at microscopic levels within our bodies. Conversations happening within family systems, within societal systems, within and between species. And within the biospheres where we all live. Conversations happening between the sun and the planets, between galaxies and one another. And the conversation was God. This suggests that God is the dynamic intimacy of relationship, a verb like it was in Hebrew, a verb of back and forth, of connection, of love that created everything and connects everything and moves everything forward. Everything, as in the whole cosmos, not just humans, but including humans, all things, way larger than humans. The conversation holds all things together, from cosmos to nations to ecosystems to your own psyche to this crazy culture that we have. Practicing the presence of God is rooted in the very DNA of life. It's everything working together. When we converse with each other, our conversation becomes a holy space of exchange, a space in which I release some of what I used to be in order to include you. And we are both changed. Conversation is expansive and unlimited and reciprocal, requiring at least two particular beings to participate in an embodied relationship. When two or more are gathered in my name, I am there with them. So what happened? Why is it that this translation consistently translated for 3 centuries as sermo or conversation cannot be found in any version of the New Testament that you can read today? Rather than conversation, the passage has been translated as we all know it. In the beginning was the Word. I'm proposing that a long history of patriarchy and mistranslation and empire has actively suppressed this translation for 1700 years. Restoring the original translation has the potential to completely reframe how we understand our interactions with spirit and with nature and with one another. But something happened in the 4th century that Nancy mentioned in her introduction that stopped the patriarchs from translating logos as sermo and started translating it as verbum, or word, a single, it's not even a word, it means a single vocable, a single sound. I believe it was an intentional decision that went against the grammatical and historical use of the word logos, and it matters. Language not only describes things, but it also produces culture. A cultural lens that defines a successful life in terms of nouns or things will be concerned with an insatiable pursuit of more things. And in that quest for owning more things, the ones with the most things are given the most power and thirst for more power. It's called empire. These are the ones who get to control the narrative and write the history. The Oxford Dictionary defines empire as a governing system that's focused on becoming and remaining the single supreme authority. And it will destroy anything in its path. You may have noticed this. So around the 4th century, Rome was about to collapse, the empire. And at the end of the 3rd century, because there were so many colonized peasants in the Roman Empire that were starting to rebel, it was getting difficult to control everybody. So the emperor at the time found a way to save the empire by sharing leadership, which is a very un-empire thing to do. So what happened is 4 different rulers were given 4 different sections of the empire. And it only took about 30 years for one of the ruler's sons, named Constantine, who ruled a portion of the West, to kill everybody else and become the sole emperor of the Roman Empire. So without going into all the gory details that you guys probably already know, just to say that Constantine had an agenda. He had an agenda when he gathered together a group of bishops to represent, who represented this diverse set of interpretations of who God was, and they were trying to create the noun of God. Like, how can this noun work in our Greek and our Roman understanding? If Jesus is God and Spirit is God, how can they all be one God? So they gathered together, and there was a bunch of really vehement fighting going on about this. There were different ways, there were a bunch of different interpretations of this that were going on. But that made Constantine, who had just decided that Christianity was not going to be outlawed anymore, because putting Christianity on their shields and their uniforms helped him to kill a couple of the other empire's armies. So Christianity was now the in religion, and there was way too many different interpretations. So religion, this is me projecting into what Constantine was thinking a lot of years ago. A religion that asserts a single ruling identity for the deity would be really helpful to remind folks that there was a new solo empire too, a new solo emperor in the empire. So there was this fight going on for who was going to control the narrative of this newly legal church of the Roman Empire. And the dissenting voices were being shut down, and there was this whole war over the doctrine of the Trinity. So Constantine personally invited these 300 or so of the 1,800 bishops in the empire and escorted them free of charge to the imperial palace in Nicaea. So the bishops, all of them male, of course, were there to come to agreement about this hierarchy of the Godhead nouns. Defining the nounness of God correctly was an ongoing obsession with these men. And the Nicene Creed was the result. So these early church fathers used language, in my opinion, as a tool of dominance. From what I've read, the whole lot of them were pretty power hungry. They were cloying for position and recognition, and they attacked one another mercilessly. And these were the men who controlled the narrative. The Nicene Creed was meant to settle the God-noun argument and condemn any who dissented as heretics. And it's been used since then as a statement of orthodoxy with slight adaptations throughout history. But the Council of Nicaea didn't end that rivalry. For another 60 years, the debate over how to arrange the nouns of the three entities to describe God continued, and people were excommunicated and exiled and killed over it. Finally, an official and sanctioned version of the New Testament was to be written and put an end to any dissenting voices. In that, the decision was made to use verbum to translate logos for the opening hymn of John 1. Verbum means just one single vocable, the smallest fragment of language that has meaning, a single word. While it doesn't make grammatical, contextual, or historical sense, it does make a point. Word fit the objective of the single supreme authority of the now official Holy Roman Catholic Church. After all, allowing conversation or sermo to define the essence of Christ could encourage those dissenting voices to be heard. No, they had to be effectively shut down. Word was better. No back and forth, no room for dissent, no changes, just one and only one word, the last word, the capital W word, the inaugurable word, the end of discussion word, what everybody else's word is heresy word. The hierarchy chooses word, and so it remains word. End of conversation. This translation decision went unquestioned for more than 1,000 years, and the debate about logos was largely forgotten. But then a man in the 16th century, a contemporary of church reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin, translated the book of John and the rest of the New Testament directly from the original Greek documents. He was the first one to do so in 1,000 years. Erasmus of Rotterdam, a committed Catholic, didn't side theologically with the reformers like Luther and Calvin, but he dared challenge the Vulgate, that official translation of the New Testament. He was fiercely dedicated to academic scholarship, and he had no sponsors. He wasn't officially in the church, because he was one of those people that just wanted to be maniacally committed to his scholarship. He translated the New Testament 25 times. The very first time he was afraid to make that change from word to conversation. But he quickly realized that was wrong. And so the next 24 translations all included word as conversation. And he ignited a gigantic controversy. As you can imagine, the institution of the Holy Empire freaked out. Some Protestant reformers, including Calvin and Zwingli and Luther, they cheered his efforts, but many more reviled him for it. One of the scholars around this, Marjorie O'Rourke Boyle, says that Erasmus spent more ink defending his translation of Logos than he did penning translations of the entire Bible, which he did 25 times. And 10 years after Erasmus's death, the Catholic Church convened the Council of Trent to not only condemn the Protestants, but also to condemn the work of Erasmus, and they ordered all copies of his translation to be burned. And they issued an edict that the only true word of God was the Vulgate, the official and approved biblical text of the one and only true church. In the beginning was the Word, just one word, my word, not yours. Using the word and the metaphor of conversation rather than word as the most grammatically, contextually, and emotionally accurate translation of this pivotal scripture, suppressed by 1,700 years of patriarchy, reviving this word is an act of resistance. This translation of conversation tells me that Jesus, as the Christ, is a way of understanding that his role is that an in-between presence, a presence between creator and created, a presence between transcendent and the incarnated, and not just for Jesus, for all of us. We are connected by conversation, a holy conversation. Even the trees and the microbes and the stars are made and imbued with inherent dignity, are beholders of the indwelling of the Logos of the Christ, and we are held together by a great conversation. Ba Midbar, the organ which speaks. Christ as dynamic, abundant relationship, interrelated connections, navigated by conversation. Christ, in fact, feels like the opposite of a static word, a single utterance controlled by powerful men and powerful institutions. Christ as conversation, that we all carry Christ within us, that our connection between is the presence of Christ, that conversation between all things is the manifestation of the sacred, moving forward and evolving a kingdom of grace, a wild Christ. Imagine what that one word change could do. Imagine what could happen if a spirituality that has been created by the word of authorities is transitioned to a spirituality guided by conversation with one another and with an interconnected and living world. Imagine if the imperial agenda of the powerful, by co-opting a religion for their own purposes, can have how much of an impact that agenda has had in a long history of violence and control. Imagine what would happen if a wild Christ, a conversation which is the intermediary of love between all things, that includes all the diverse voices as important and sacred. Imagine what that would be like. Is it possible to imagine the worldview of kingdoms and empires transforming into a worldview of kingdom without the G, kingdom and compassion? Imagine how different life would be right now if Christianity could become a place for sacred conversation, a place to explore possibilities and express doubts and disagree and encourage voices on the edges. Imagine the church honoring sacred conversation by lifting up the voices that have been shut down by empire. Imagine the reconciling role the church could offer in bringing together opposite forces to remember that we are all interconnected. This is what I call wild spirituality, and it's an opportunity to reorient our relationship with one another and with the whole world through a wild Christ that existed before words and churches and empires. It's an act of resistance against the attempts to sever human participation from the whole system of life. And replacing our spirituality back into the actual sacred world where it has been rooted for most of history is a way to restore our place in a more primal power embedded in the systems of earth. Wild church replaces a human kingdom paradigm of hierarchy and monarchy and inequality with the power systems of earth, which feminist theologians name as kingdom, a kingdom of cooperation and kindred reciprocity. And we, especially we in this room, as Christian leaders, are uniquely equipped to bring this. You don't need to call yourself a wild church pastor, but you can if you want to. But you do have the agency and the opportunity to help our people see that we are being called into the wild, not just to appreciate the beauty of nature, but to listen to the voice of God there at this pivotal time. We are the spiritual leaders who are being called into that intimate conversation right now. That intimate conversation that happens with the organ which speaks, Bamidbar, the conversation of wilderness. The wisdom we need right now is outside of our doors. Have you heard that call to wilderness? It's a call from the sacred. It's a call from God to listen, to allow your identity to shift and your sense of belonging to widen. A call to untame your relationship with the sacred. In this kingdom, we love neighbors, all neighbors, as ourselves. We do unto others, all others, as we would have them do unto us. Friends, we are not separate from nature. We are simply the part of nature that comes from this particular human form, with our particular interests and gifts and flaws and voices. We humans who can hear the call are urgently needed. The rainforest is calling us. The open, vast sky, suffering invisibly with too much carbon, is calling us. Future generations are calling us. God is calling us. So I leave you with this blessing. May the Spirit of God, the Spirit of the abundant earth, awaken you to live in the knowledge that you are of the earth, from the earth, and returning to the earth. May the tree of life rise up within you and root you deeply into the ground and nourish you to extend your branches into the world. Blessings of this great earth, blessings of the wild Christ, blessings of the great conversation that holds all things together, of the Christ alive and within and animating each one of you and all that is. May Christ be upon you with boundless gratitude. Amen.
My friends, I'm thinking that the schedule does not allow for questions, but Victoria, you'll be around a little bit, so I'm sure she'll be willing to talk with you. I invite us to take a 6-minute stretch as we move into preparation for worship.